Today on the I Love New Mexico podcast, you're all going to be happy to know that my great friend and one of the biggest advocates for the public in all of New Mexico, Fred Nathan from Think New Mexico, is our guest today. And for those of you who don't know about Think New Mexico, this is a bipartisan, results oriented think tank that has been serving New Mexicans for 25 years. You just had your 25th anniversary this year, right, Fred?
That's correct.
And I have a very handy dandy bio of about Fred so that I want you to know who he is, but I also want you to know that we have known each other for a very long time. In fact, I think that it was even well. Here's how long we've known each other, Fred. The year that we met each other, the governor's daughters were in a stroller, so everybody can figure out what that is. That's one of the things I remember about that year that I met you is when we went to Greek Fest and those little Grisham girls were in a stroller. Do you remember that?
I do. In fact, I took the bar review exam with the future governor. I can tell a funny off-color story. You might
Oh,
enjoy
we all
this.
have many.
Yeah, there are many Michelle stories, but when I came to New Mexico, it was 1987, and the first thing I did was to register for the bar course. And I sat in the second to last row in the middle, and right behind me was Michelle. And the first day I came in, and she was giving me a hard time saying, "You're not from here, are you?" And it went downhill from there. But she was always teasing me and saying, "Well, do you know anybody? I mean, do you have relatives here?" And I said, "No." "Do you have any friends?" "No, I'm just moving here." And anyway, the exam that year was especially grueling. It was 3 days. I don't think it's that long anymore. And there was a huge party, everybody in the course at a home near the law school. And I really had to study because I went to one of these law schools where it was all theoretical, and I really didn't know the black letter law. So anyway, I was exhausted, and I was probably the first one to leave the party at midnight. And I'm driving home in my little Chevy Nova, and there's this clanking noise. And I remember praying that I could get back to my tiny pink apartment and I'd fix it in the morning. Anyway, I get home and I look under the car to see what it was. I was thinking it was some big part driving on, and there's nothing there. And then I go to the back, and somebody had put rusty tin cans on the back of my car and wrote "just married" to rub it in that I didn't have a girlfriend in smoke. And now I wasn't so tired anymore. And I knew the only person it could be was Michelle. I drove back to the party, and I'm from New York originally, so I know a lot of bad words. And I said all of them. This is the worst career move of all time to Michelle. She never forgot it. We patched it up, but I remember I went to a fundraiser for her the first time she ran for governor. I came a little late. It was a restaurant in Santa Fe. And she said, "Oh, there's Fred Nathan. I want you all to know Fred Nathan does not have a sense of humor." And she didn't explain. And, half my friends were there, and they all said, like, "What did you do to her?" So anyway, that's my Michelle story from 1987. But never
Well,
curse out a person who might become a future governor.
well, we've done. When we do these things every once in a while on the with the Cancer Foundation, where we're all getting in a room and to get better acquainted. They'll say, "Tell us three things that two of which are a lie and one of which is the truth that you've done in your lifetime." And mine has frequently been that I've depantsed the current governor, and nobody ever believes that. But that was it was we've known her and I've known you for a really long time, but you are wow. 25 years. I have to read your bio because I'm so impressed with you. Who knew when you showed up in that little Chevy Nova, which I remember very well. um, that you would be such a driving force in the state. But I want you guys to know that Fred Nathan Jr. founded Think New Mexico and is its executive director. Fred served as special counsel to New Mexico Attorney General Tom Udall from 1991 to 1998. And in that capacity, he was the architect of several successful legislative initiatives and was in charge of New Mexico's lawsuit against the tobacco industry, which resulted in a $1.25 billion settlement for the state. Fred serves on the boards of Santa Fe Preparatory School and the Thornburg Foundation and is a former trustee of his alma mater, Williams College. So, Fred, even though you're not from New Mexico, you are doing amazing things here. And I want folks to know that if you're not familiar with Think New Mexico is in the business, as a nonprofit, of course, of changing and improving the lives of New Mexicans. I mean, one of the reasons we don't have a food tax is because of Think New Mexico. One of the reasons that predatory loans were there was reform in that area is because of the work you do. I mean, the list is long. Fred, tell me what you're proudest of. It feels like that would be difficult, but in your role as the founder and
It's,
ED.
that's like asking me to choose between my children because we
I
spend
know.
a year at least on these campaigns, sometimes 3 years. Like the food tax took 3 years to repeal. Probably the number one was our first issue to make full day kindergarten accessible to every child in the state. It was such a interesting ride, an odyssey to get there. Um, and I can tell you war stories that may or may not.
Well, I it feels like you were in the midst of a huge battle last year when you were working so hard on educational reform. We talked about that, I think, last December, and you had amazing ideas that seemed like really, I mean, it seems so common sense to do the right thing for children in terms of education. What were the advances? How do you feel about last year's initiative?
So 2 years ago, we did a report on creating sort of a roadmap for fixing our educational system, and we had 10 major proposals. We also hired a wonderful woman named Mandy Torres, who's a former 2020 New Mexico Teacher of the Year, to lead the campaign and be the tip of that spear. And I'm pleased to say that we've got about 30% of it done. One was to get more time on task. It's really remarkable how little time actually is spent on learning. And that's sort of the low-lying fruit that's pretty much worked everywhere. A second proposal that we got to the finish line was to create teacher residencies. So rather than what we've been doing, which is, a teacher comes out of a college of education and they immediately get thrown in the deep end and they're given a class. What other states have found success with, and which we've recommended here, are to create these teacher residencies where new teachers are paired with a seasoned teacher for a year or at least a semester so they can learn things about class, how to keep control of the classroom and so forth. And what's been shown nationally is that teachers that do these residencies stay in the profession almost twice as long as those that don't have teacher residencies. Mandy, for example, did 2 residencies before she ever got her own classroom and then later became the Teacher of the Year. That's anecdotal. But anyway, so that's well on its way to being something that every new teacher in New Mexico will have. We're up to about, I think, 40% of teachers. And then a third thing that we got to the finish line just last year was to improve the training of school board members, which doesn't sound like that big a deal, but so many of the most important issues really weren't part of the training. For example, how do you read a budget and do a budget? These school board members collectively are basically spending about $4 billion. And there's a lot of jargon in education budgets. And what we were hearing was there was a lot of rubber stamping. And so that'll now be a part of the training so that they learn to, ask the important questions like, if we approve this budget, how much will that increase spending in the classroom versus central administrative spending? What really counts is dollars spent in the classroom. Governance, there's still a lot of confusion around what are the roles and responsibilities of school board members. The average tenure of a superintendent in New Mexico is 2 years. And what we discovered is the reason, and obviously that's part of the problem. If you have the person at the top of the district constantly changing, that doesn't work in business or nonprofits or government. And the reason there's so much turnover, we learned from talking to superintendents, is new school board members get elected and they immediately go to the superintendent and say, I want you to fire the football coach, the athletic director, and my next door neighbor who's a third grade teacher. And then the superintendent has to explain, well, actually, that's my decision, not your decision. You just have one employee. That's me, the superintendent. And then the superintendent is shown the door. The joke is to be a successful superintendent in New Mexico, you have to be able to count to 3. And the reason is because you always have to have 3 of the 5 school board members on your side. But a better approach would be just to train them up on their roles and responsibilities so we don't create this turnstile. And then a third thing that wasn't in the training is, what can you do as a school board member to lift academic outcomes? For example, in North Dakota, every district has to choose from a menu of school reform issues like closing the achievement gap, increasing high school graduation rates, increasing literacy rates. In New Mexico, we found that many districts didn't have any academic goals. So anyway, so that was a third issue that we've gotten to the finish line. And this year we're going to try to reduce class sizes and cap class sizes from kindergarten to third grade at no more than 20 students. We're 50th in the country in reading by the third grade. And we think part of the problem is, and we've documented this, about a third of those classes are, 25, 26. There's some, in 2024, there are some classes with 34, 35 students, and we wonder why teachers aren't able to get everyone reading. And, I know because I have a daughter who's actually not in New Mexico, but she's got a second grade class of 32 students. And she says to me, Dad, when it's just me, sometimes she has a co-teacher, sometimes she doesn't. When it's just her, she says, I have to choose between teaching or trying to control the classroom. It's triage. So we're certain this is something that would be very effective, not only increase reading rates, but also reduce teacher attrition. A lot of teachers just are frustrated that they're given so many students, they can't give each student the attention they deserve, and they leave the profession. So this is something that would be good both for the students and for the teachers.
Well, I strongly support that because, as you know, I come from I graduated. I was almost in
Logan.
the top 10% of my class because there were 17 of us and I was number 2. So,
Uh-huh. That counts.
but it makes a huge difference. And this year, I thought education was going to be my favorite reform ever, but this year you're really speaking to something that's very near and dear to my heart. So explain to our listeners what your initiative is this year.
So this year's focus, also a 10-point plan, and we've hired a healthcare reform director named Alfredo Vigil, who was Governor Richardson's healthcare secretary. And when he found out we were doing this, he came out of retirement to help lead this effort. And basically in New Mexico, we have a terrible shortage of basically every kind of medical professional, doctors, nurses, EMTs, the list goes on and on. And we thought it was time to put a spotlight on that and come up with some recommendations. And so we will be taking 4 of the 10 recommendations. We don't have the bandwidth to try to do the whole thing. But, I just, every time I talk to a Rotary Club, Oftentimes they say, well, how do you pick your topics? And I say, well, we look for things that are big enough to make a difference, but small enough to be politically achievable. And then I always say, but my best ideas come from groups like this. What do you think we should tackle? And so often I hear, I can't find a doctor, or if I can find a doctor, I can't get in to see my doctor. And, if you're ever with a Rotary group or any group of people, ask those people that can't find a doctor to stand up, and then say, and then those of you that have a doctor and can't get in to see them, you stand up, and pretty soon you have the whole room standing. And it's just a great illustration of how monumental this challenge is. And we think, better to start now than to wait longer, because it's only going to get worse. About 40% of our doctors, for example, are 60 or over, and they're going to retire by 2030. So this problem is going to get worse before it gets better, and it's why it's so imperative that the legislature and the governor address some of these issues
Well, and
and try to make.
I'm sorry.
Go
It just
ahead.
seems that some of it is very common sense, isn't it? I mean, some of those fixes seem so doable. I read your annual report and I thought, well, I mean, explain to people why this. I mean, other than we're somewhat rural and a small state population wise, what are the
Yeah. So you're exactly right, Bunny, that so many of these issues, I joke around when I talk about it, you don't need to work at a think tank, because you're right. So many of these things are common sense. I'll just throw out one that we'll be working on. We're one of only two states that taxes medical services, like and so the doctors here, Hawaii is the only other state that does this. So when you pay your deductible or your copay, um, your doctor actually pays the tax, the gross receipts tax on that. They can't pass it on to Medicaid or Medicare, because under federal law, the federal government won't pay it. If you're privately insured, the insurance companies put it in their contracts that they don't pay that tax. If you look across the state, the average GRT is about 7%. Here in Santa Fe, it's much larger. I forget what it is. It's, I think, higher than 8%. So they eat that. So when medical students are leaving medical school and deciding where to locate a practice, and they do any research, that you start behind the eight ball here in New Mexico, if you come here, because that's something you won't encounter in any other state other than Hawaii. So that would be an example. Credentialing would be another example. A lot of people don't understand, when you're a doctor, you have to be credentialed by every hospital where you might practice and every insurance company that might pay your doctor bill. And remarkably, these insurance companies and hospitals haven't come up with one credentialing document. And these documents are very thick and very time consuming. So, one thing I've heard over and over from doctors, and we're going to try to fix this, Arkansas, for example, created a law and said, come together and there'll be one credentialing document, so that doctors, when they move to a state, they can immediately start practicing. I talked to an eye doctor here in Santa Fe who said it was several months. He was ready and able to practice, but he had to get all these credentials approved by various insurance companies and hospitals, and he couldn't start practicing for 3 months, even though there's a shortage here of eye doctors and we desperately need them, and there were patients that needed to see this doctor. So that's another example of what you were talking about, Bunny, about many of these things aren't particularly complicated. It's just sometimes we lack the political will, to address these things. So
what
I can go
what
on and on about other issues.
Well, so I know we are in pretty amazingly good financial shape um, right now with the oil and gas revenues. I just read the number and I honestly can't remember it. I just read it this morning. But what's the hit if medical services are no longer, if they no longer have to pay gross receipts taxes?
It's really not that much. I don't know if I guess I'll get the number wrong. We have an economist now, Katie Gutierrez, who told me the number last week. I think it's like $20 million, but it's actually not very. It won't be a hit to the budget at all because they suspended. To their great credit, the legislature suspended this tax 2 years ago, and we're just simply saying, just abolish it. It's supposed to sunset in 3 years. There's absolutely no reason to bring this back. It makes us uncompetitive with the rest of the country. So when the budgeteers look at our bill, they'll score it as zero because it's not something that's currently being paid. Although I have talked to some doctors in certain practices, it's really complicated. And I think some of them continue to have to pay it. It's very complicated. And so we'd like to just abolish it and make New Mexico like the rest of the country, where doctors
So
don't have to pay their patients' gross receipts tax.
don't we also have some crazy medical malpractice? Um, I want to hear about that one because
Yeah,
that's a little infuriating.
we have the most lopsided medical malpractice system in the country in terms of patients, doctors, hospitals, and lawyers. The best system is one that makes those patients that are harmed whole, that pays lawyers a reasonable amount of money, that doesn't chase doctors away and doesn't bankrupt hospitals. Our current system doesn't do any of those things. So, for example, just to start, we're one of a state that doesn't cap attorney's fees. Even progressive states like New York and California put a cap on attorney's fees. The system is sort of a zero-sum game. The more that the attorneys get, the less that goes to their clients, the patients who have been harmed by medical malpractice. That's one example. A second example is there's something called the Patients Compensation Fund, and that's to take care of examples where there's a medical malpractice. There are caps right now for hospitals and doctors. For hospitals, for example, it goes as high as $6 million. So let's say somebody's been harmed and their medical damages exceed $6 million. Well, they can go to this patient compensation fund, and the legislature created a lump sum payment. It used to be to pay the rest of this person's medical damages for the rest of their lives. But it was sort of a pay-as-you-go system. But the legislature created a lump sum payment right at the beginning. Sometimes it's not enough to pay for those patients. Sometimes it pays too much because they die sooner than expected, so the taxpayer takes the hit. But it's wonderfully convenient for the trial lawyers because they can take their percentage out of the lump sum payment. Even though this is a patient compensation system, it's not called the patient and attorney compensation fund. And we don't think that the lawyers should take any of that money. That should all go to the patient. A third issue is punitive damages. Punitive damages, for your listeners, is something that should be rarely awarded in those cases that are considered to be outrageous. In New Mexico, we have the lowest standard for punitive damages in the country. The standard is by a preponderance of the evidence. So if the judge or the jury is, say, 51% sure that punitive damages are merited, they can award those. So, for example, recently there was a hernia case in Gallup gone wrong, and $58 million was awarded in punitive damages. That's going to bankrupt that hospital in Gallup, which now has 340 medical providers, doctors, nurses, and so forth, that will lose their jobs. It also serves 56,000 people in Gallup. it will create, if that hospital is forced to close as a result of these punitive damages, that those people will be in a medical desert where the closest hospital is probably in Albuquerque. And if you have a heart attack in Gallup, or if you have a stroke, those are two things where you have to get to a hospital, obviously, immediately. And someone there explained to me, this is like a death sentence for our community. And it will harm, obviously, that community. People will leave. It will. We've really got to reconsider how we do punitive damages. Other states use a much higher standard. Most of them use clear and convincing evidence. Colorado uses the criminal law standard, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's something that's got to be fixed. Another thing that's never talked about that's in the law is something called venue shopping. So let's say there's a malpractice that results in death in, say, Hobbs, or one of our more conservative areas of the state. What they'll often do is get a lawyer in Santa Fe or Las Vegas or Espanola, where juries are much more generous than they are in Hobbs. And they'll move the case, even though the victim was in Hobbs, the doctor was in Hobbs, the nurse was in Hobbs, the physician assistant was in Hobbs. They'll move it to Santa Fe, where the lawyer is, and then they can get these larger, more generous judgments. We think that there shouldn't be any venue shopping. The cases ought to be tried where the actors are, where the witnesses are, and that would help tremendously. Then one final thing about this, Bunny, as you might imagine, medical malpractice premiums have gone through the roof. There's this term called the insurance loss ratio, which we got from the Department of Insurance, that showed last year, for every dollar that medical malpractice insurance companies collected in premiums, they paid $1.83 in claims. So not surprisingly, we have fewer and fewer insurance companies that are willing to write insurance in New Mexico. That means that premiums go up, sometimes substantially. There's a hospital in Raton that was just profiled in Searchlight, and I think their premium went up by 500%. They had to find out of the country insurance companies that would write these really cost prohibitive policies. I can tell you here in Santa Fe, I talked to Lillian Montoya, who's the CEO, and she explained, yes, our insurance premiums have gone through the roof, and that cuts into our ability to do charity care because it's a zero-sum game, right? I mean, if they're spending all this money on insurance, that's less that they can provide for those patients who can't afford their medical services. So this medical malpractice system doesn't make patients whole, chases doctors away. A lot of doctors don't want to practice here because if you get sued, there may be no merit to your case, but do you really want to roll the dice, as one explained to me? Because if there's punitive damages, it can, bankrupt you and take everything that you've earned over a lifetime. And so you're really, if you're a doctor, you really have to think carefully as to whether this system, makes sense for you and your family. So we're trying to address all of these issues, and there are other issues as well that we could take the whole show to talk about. We really need to wake up this sleeping giant, because if every doctor would just give $100 to their PAC, they'd be able to neutralize how much the trial lawyers give, and then these issues could be heard, on the merits rather than which side has clout and which side doesn't. And the public needs to get involved, and people need to share their lived experience with their legislators and talk about how difficult it is to find a doctor or to get in to see those doctors. I just went to see my dermatologist this week and found out that he's retiring. So
He's mine too.
okay. Dr. Bowden,
Go
who's
Brad.
terrific, I'm guessing.
Play
Yeah.
some pickleball.
So we really need to educate the public about why we have these issues and get the public to talk to their legislators and the governor and the lieutenant governor and anyone who will listen.
So I, I I think it's probably hard for people to hear, although I think if you live in the world today, you should know that whoever it's hard to hear that choices will be made for the good, for the better of the community in which we live, based on who made the largest campaign contributions. But that just is part of how this works.
That's everywhere. I mean, it's not just New Mexico. That's Congress for sure. And from what I hear when I talk to my colleagues in other states, there are a lot of special interests out there and they know how to play the game. And it really behooves everybody to, even if you don't want to or can't afford to make political contributions, at least call your legislators and contact them. And we try to make it easy at Think New Mexico. They can go to the Action Center on our website. Our website's www.thinknewmexico.org. You just click on the Action Center, you type in your address, and the computer brings up who your state senator is, who your state representative is, and you can write one letter to to the governor, the lieutenant governor, your state senator, your state rep. We make it easy by having a pre-scripted letter, and we have no pride of authorship. We encourage people to write, again, their lived experience with the medical system and the lack of accessibility to doctors and other providers. And I want to emphasize the shortage isn't just doctors, nurses. Probably the biggest deficit, we look at all these medical categories, is emergency medical technicians. We're about 5,000 short for the entire
Wow.
state of New Mexico, particularly in rural New Mexico where they're desperately needed. One thing we're trying to do there is the legislature did a smart thing several years ago when they created a rural healthcare tax credit for every sort of medical category, although they left out a few, including emergency medical technicians. So we're trying to expand that tax credit to EMTs because we have this gigantic shortage. And there's about four other categories, and I can't remember them all right now.
Well, I know, I mean, where I grew up, all the EMTs still are volunteers. And my parents were volunteer EMTs for like 27 years. And so they would get every time they went on a ambulance run, they'd get $5 off of their water bill.
Oh,
So, so you're up all night hauling somebody to Albuquerque. But I guess what I want people to hear is that just saying something and talking to your legislator makes a huge difference. I mean, the first time I went to DC with a group called Fight Colorectal Cancer, um, and I met with my senators and representatives there. I said something. I think it was to and I was in Martin Heinrich's office, and I said, I was so nervous to come here and talk to you about what's important to me about changing some of these laws that keep people from getting screened for colon cancer. And I'm not a professional, and I was told um, by whatever authority it was that I spoke to at that time that that's this is a state where people where your representatives want to hear from you. I mean, they don't want to hear from lobbyists nearly as much as they want to hear from the humans. These people, I mean, not everybody runs for office. I mean, I think that everybody who runs for office at least begins with altruistic service notions. So those people want to hear from you. Don't think that what you say or whatever small amount of money, I'm just going to give you a plug, Fred, because I think every year I donate money to your cause because I think it's so important to have
thank you.
a neutral voice um, that's making a difference. So yes, go to the Action Center. write some notes. In those smaller communities, I know you run in, if you live in Mosquero, you're going to run into your representative. Tell them what's going on and what you care about, because that's where change is made.
Yeah, and I spoke to a doctor when we were just starting this campaign, and she was telling me, she said, "I'm part of the problem, Fred," and I